And thanks, Neven, for this inspiring perspective on the conceptualizing ideas and challenges around, rethinking the fight against anti-Semitism. So I think this was a perfect platform building, like a first pillar of what we're trying to look at. I will try to add on a more practical operational side in terms of law enforcement, how the response to anti-Semitism could be handled differently, upgraded, so to say. Some of you have heard some of these aspects before because it is one of the key aspects of the report that we produced for the Federal Foreign Office. But nevertheless, I will share with you a presentation where those of you who have been around our work will maybe see a few things they've seen before, but there's also some new aspects. So stay with me and let's try to consider upgrading the fight against anti-Semitism by identifying and combating what we have called organized anti-Semitic networks. Now, the study has been mentioned a couple of times. It is also in the invitation email, the link to it, and it will also be in the after webinar email. So you will definitely be able to look into this. It is, I think, a resource because we're looking at 6 different countries, the legal situation, the policy responses, the social the civil society responses, and so on and so on. So if you maybe over Christmas have some time to read, this would be it. Now, continuing on the idea of conceptualizing changes in how we address anti-Semitism, we came up with this concept of differentiating between general acts of anti-Semitism, which might be individual or small group, often spontaneous, and organized professional anti-Semitism, networks and professional actors who systematically mobilize violent anti-Semitic narratives and incidents for their ideological, financial, or political gain. Now, we often try to learn from adjunct fields, other projects we're working in based on our previous work in other careers, for example. And we came up with this idea. We were inspired by, of course, learning from how there's a difference between general crime and organized crime responses by governments, legislation, and law enforcement. So differentiating between individual acts of theft or robbery and basically business structures of professionals. You could consider here the so-called Italian mafia, for example. You could look at cartels, right? So this distinction makes a lot of sense to develop targeted responses, but also to help analyzing and understanding strategies. And also in the fight against anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing, you can, of course, look at all the data, but then you have to differentiate between noise and signal. And for that, for example, risk scoring models have been developed. So you're trying to find also the big fish. Sometimes you look for a specific incident, person, or group, but if you make a pattern analysis, a network analysis, you try to find the big fish. And in the work on disinformation, countering disinformation, the idea to differentiate between people who are reposting or commenting on disinformation on one hand, and so-called super spreaders who are actually producing and pushing out most of these false narratives has been established and is also an inspiration for this approach. So the comparative lens indicates that it is clearly possible and from our perspective helpful and necessary to differentiate between individual acts of anti-Semitism and organized anti-Semitism with the objective to give policymakers, law enforcement, intelligence services tools to prioritize and disrupt the relatively small number of professional actors who are basically using anti-Semitic narratives for mobilization also towards violence. Now, a typology in different groups might be helpful. Starting from the very left, we have the professional propagandists, influencers, content creators whose main product are anti-Semitic narratives. We have professional organizers who organize, for example, specific demonstrations, for example, where Hamas is being glorified or October 7 attacks are being glorified, do all kinds of events and campaigns. Then we have people who are responsible for collecting, generating money in general. So this could be crowdfunding, this could be membership fees, this could be all kinds of merchandise activities, collecting money to fund the overall organized anti-Semitic activity. And then, as you have heard and maybe seen last time, about 4 weeks ago, we had a whole webinar on the linkages between organized anti-Semitism and organized crime, where we have seen on the extreme right, on the Islamist spectrum, and ethno-nationalist, let's say pro-Palestinian extremist side overlap with organized crime, either as a service, as temporary linkages, or as hybrid organizations. Now, the policy implications of, for example, such a typology would be to enable targeted responses, again, for policy makers, law enforcement, to distinguish who to regulate, who to investigate and prosecute, and where, for example, administrative measures would be appropriate. Now, you have seen this picture, this example, if you've been following CEP, because it is one of the best case studies. So you all have heard of Samidun, which is an organization associated with the PFLP, a, let's say, formerly left-wing ethno-nationalist pro-Palestinian terrorist organization, which has been designated by most countries as a terrorist organization. A subgroup is Samidun, collecting money to support prisoners, for example, that they have from their activities. And here you have one person, the international coordinator, who obviously glorifies, justifies October 7. And she is also a main person of Mazar Badil, which is, if you look at this structure, like these Russian dolls, the Matrushka dolls, where you have a big doll, and if you can open it up, there's a smaller one inside, and there's a smaller one inside, a smaller one inside. And this is one of the network strategies that we have here. We have a designated terrorist organization, decades in operation, the PFLP. We have the Samidun that was founded a decade ago or 15 years ago. And then we have Mazar Badil as the latest evolution, going from a more structurally solid approach, being a real organization, into an open network approach to make it difficult for law enforcement, for example, to analyze and potentially disrupt illegal activities, right? So here we see an event that took place in Germany in 2023, before October 7, with participants from France, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Austria, Sweden, United States, and Canada. And this is one of the cases that are, and there are many cases available, where we say, focus on networks and actors, the organized anti-Semites who have a long track record. They did not pop up on October 7. They've been around for a long time. They get up in the morning and their job is to organize anti-Semitism. And they might be in a webinar right now because it's a transnational network. They try to collaborate, they try to get financing, and they try to update their strategies. This also helps reducing the risk of conflating citizens who advocate for legitimate demands, be it a ceasefire or for a Palestinian state, with these key anti-Semitic actors whose main objective is the destruction of the state of Israel as a Jewish state and otherwise related threats to Jewish life in Europe, the US, or in the Middle East, of course. Now, again, this is a picture that many of you, a screenshot that some of you have seen already. On the left side, an Instagram posting from Palestine Speaks. On the right side, you see a picture from the Nova Music Festival, which was attacked by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other terrorists on October 7. 378 people were killed at this music festival. And here you see the lesson in liberation from Gaza. Sounds innocent in a way, but then you see the paragliders that were used to cross the border fence between Gaza and southern Israel. So this is obviously a reference to the attack. You have this posting on October 8. So this was before the Israeli defense forces were doing any major operations outside of Israel, because they were still fighting attackers in Israel. And in this context, for example, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is a clear justification, glorification of terroristic violence. The slogan itself is context depending, but here, so if we look at date, if we look at symbols, if we look at actors, it is clearly identifiable. Now, I've been showing this post for a while now, and just recently, Palestine Speaks was taken off, so the profile was removed from the platform. But of course, all the others here that are listed are still available. And of course, there's a second version of the profile. You also see that when this was posted, there's like 2,848 84 people that liked this posting and so on. So there is a broad network. 18 months after this was posted, the profile was removed, but of course there's a follow-up profile and the rest of the network is still there. How to identify and disrupt such key anti-Semitic actors, organized anti-Semites. We have a 5-step guide as a recommendation on how to do this. Also, the link is in the invitation email and we will send it around again. So, understanding organized anti-Semitism as a strategic threat, not just as a side aspect, building on what Neven said and what we've been saying in previous webinars, is of course one of the key aspects here. Another aspect is to go from the reactive mode, there is an incident and then there's activities, to a more proactive mindset. Analog to the idea to differentiate between general crime and organized crime, focus on professional anti-Semites. We need proactive investigations here into which of these groups might be receiving public funding. This is not a joke. This is happening quite often in Germany and other countries, because maybe public funders are not aware of that aspect of the organization. You know, nobody is advertising their anti-Semitism usually to get public funding in Europe, but it's sometimes difficult to know all the aspects of what a group is actually doing. We have some linkages to terrorism financing, maybe when there's support of Hamas. Sometimes there's a lot of money being moved, even if it's not a lot of money. Without money, it's very difficult to do anything. So are these folks that are being classified as organized anti-Semites, the individuals, the networks, the organizations, the associated businesses, are they paying their taxes properly? You might know that this is one of the major work streams of CEP, with a focus on right-wing extremism in this context. But of course, the structure and the concept can be applied to any kind of violent extremism. We might have fraudulent applications and reception of COVID-19 support funds here. There might be, due to criminal activities, money laundering activities, and of course the mentioned organized crime linkages. This is just to again exemplify the differentiation between, there's a lot of people who might have anti-Semitic feelings or ideas, some of them sometimes act out on them, that's one thing. And the other is people who organize violent anti-Semitism. And here, this is supposed to show that governments have different toolkits, mandates, possibilities to address violent extremism and terrorism, depending on their setup as an organization. For example, you would have law enforcement that looks at politically motivated crimes, law enforcement that looks at financially motivated crimes, prosecutors, tax authorities, intelligence agencies, financial intelligence units. And the idea is really, as a concrete recommendation, to have task forces that investigate, and this can be on a local level, on a state level, on a national level, on an international level, the key actors of organized anti-Semitism. Again, we have laid out this idea to a bit more in the report. Now, upgrading the fight against anti-Semitism, considering it as it is, as a strategic driver, not just prejudice. Current approaches are incident-focused. We record and react to thousands of incidents, but there's not enough, from our understanding and work in the field, not enough priority being put into understanding and disrupting the actual rather small number of organized professional actors. So focusing on organized anti-Semitic networks and organizations is practical, is scalable, doesn't require a change in law. When we would target such organizations as super spreaders or other categories, this would allow for potentially very effective disruption. And as a result, we would have fewer anti-Semitic high-impact actors. There will always be anti-Semitism, unfortunately, like other kinds of prejudice, racism, and so on. But we would make it harder for those whose life's work, whose business model it is to foster hatred in the context and call for violence in the context of anti-Semitism. So developing national and local disruption-oriented strategies focusing on organized anti-Semitic actors is a clear recommendation, as you can imagine by now. Addressing the transnational dimension is very important because most of these networks are transnational. And then, of course, the social media companies in this context. On one hand, anti-Semitism doesn't need social media. It has a 1,000-year track record, if you want to look at it this way. But we are seeing, and Matthias Becker, who unfortunately can't be with us today for health reasons, he would have shared, amongst other things, a recent Stanford study that is published in the magazine Nature in November, so very fresh, that looked at the role of amplification of the role of platforms and their algorithms into the sentiments of users, spreading, for example, narratives that are extreme, right? So we are still struggling dealing with the big social media platforms. Now, there was something that we did when we were dealing with tobacco companies, for example, right? So there's no ban on tobacco, but there's a label when you buy the cigarettes that shows you what tobacco can do to your lungs and your body. I'm not sure if that is a model that has a huge effect, despite all the changes in the consummation of tobacco, but labeling platforms who underperform in their self-declared, for example, terms of service. So they say we don't allow profiles of dangerous organizations, of anti-Semitic organizations, of anti-Islam organizations. But then we see that they're not really enforcing this. They could be labeled as something like super spreaders, right? So I am frustrated after 10 years of working on these companies and partially with these companies that the little progress that was achieved has mostly been rendered void in the last year, basically. and we all hope for the Digital Services Act to fix a lot. We will see how that goes, but that's a final concrete